That will never work. You can't push that. Seriously? Don't. Oh my God, that's other things you can do. That's bad. You probably should find other hobbies. You ever learn how to stop? Stop. Be happy. Quit while you're Don't bother me. I've seen better. Do you really want to and my third grade, give it up. Welcome to Horrible Writing, the rawest, most candid, in-your-face writing show on the interwebs because none of us have time to suck. Let's do this. Welcome to episode 42 of Horrible Writing. I'm your host, Paul Sading. This time we're going to do another author-writer interview in our series of writer interviews. I'm absolutely humbled this time to have someone I've been dying to talk to for quite some time and pick his brain on. And the topic that we're going to talk about, I feel personally, is going to be a very interesting conversation because of where we're coming from. You all know, you've been following my audio dramas. You know that I've got 2 books that are going to be published this year, both which are horror. And the person I'm about to introduce also tends to dabble in the darker offerings, the darker stories that the world, many of you already know as soon as I say them. Who I have with me today to talk about empathy is none other than Mr. Paul Bay of the Black Tapes and the Big Loop fame. Paul, welcome to Horrible Writing, and thanks for joining us.
Hi, Paul. Thanks for having me.
Man, it feels like we just got done talking.
It does, doesn't it?
Listeners in the future, you'll never know this, but Paul's been a very gracious guest. This is the second time we're going to go at it. The world is such an ugly, hate-filled place that it doesn't want us talking about empathy. It crashed my recording while we were having a great talk, and Paul's been kind enough to come back on because he's empathetic to my plight. He's willing to come back and see if we can give this another go. So, Paul, you and I did some talking, and like I do with all my guests, I want to make sure that we focus on a topic they're comfortable, and you pretty easily identified one. You said, hey, let's talk about building yourself as an empathetic writer, an empathetic and informed creator. And I said, man, that's genius. Let's go with it. So can you kind of walk us through that that evolutionary process for you? Have you always been an empathetic person, or is that something you've had to work on over the years?
No, I was a bastard. I was quite the idiot growing up. This is something that happened through life whittling away at me. It was like an involuntary evolution and building of empathy. Like I didn't plan for it. It just happened, and it became a survival thing where if I want to survive, I'm going to have to do it by putting myself in other people's shoes, or else I'm going to be this really arrogant SOB for the rest of my life. Mm-hmm. And it's funny because I chose that topic because at the timing of you asking me which topic I wanted to do, I was writing season 2 of The Big Loop, which I'm still doing. And I've never said this publicly, so this is the first time, but I often get asked what is the point of The Big Loop anthology series, because it's multi-genre. It's like horror, sci-fi, some dark comedy without any genre elements. So what's the point of it? And I knew it was to build empathy. It was like sort of a thing where I'm hoping that you see these characters in very complex situations. They're never black and white if they're right or wrong. But as long as you feel empathy for them, you'll start to understand them. And that was the whole point of it. So when you asked me, this was an easy topic for me to jump at.
And I think it's a very important topic to talk about, especially in the context of reality, 2018, not just 2018, but the last few years across the world. I think a lot of us can identify, regardless of your stance on a lot of things, ideologies, that the world seems, or at least the focus of the world seems to be on not necessarily empathy, not necessarily apathy, but there is a lot of it, in my opinion anyways. So when you did propose this, I just couldn't jump at it fast enough. And I think that's a really interesting way to look at the Black Loop now, too, when I hear those stories. And I have, you and I know, you know this, I've shared this with you publicly on Twitter, but just recently did a binge of it myself. And now that you've said that, I can definitely tie it back to a number of the stories from that season. I can see, so you did well. It was very subtle. and it was an emotional reaction I had during the season. But now, now I'm making that cognitive connection as well. So, what was the genesis of this for you? Was there a genesis, or was it just kind of something organic that you recognized at some fork in the road and made a conscious effort to start developing or being better at being more empathetic?
I think it has to do with me always sort of aggressively going after what I believe to be my thing. So when I graduated from university, I wanted to be a youth pastor. I used to want to go to law school, but then I converted to evangelical Christianity in my undergrad. So I became a youth pastor in Vancouver. And I'll be honest, I was a good, energetic, useful for the church, evangelical pastor, but I was also very homophobic. When I say homophobic, if you in that context in 1992, 1993, if you had heard me speak at a church, you wouldn't say, "Oh, that guy hates gay people." You wouldn't think that. You would hear me talk about, well, God loves gay people, but you have to repent of your ways, the way I have to repent of my heterosexual lustful thoughts, and I would put them on an equal plane that way, like the way they are with something that I can choose, and so which is very hateful, right, in hindsight. But at the time, I didn't think of it as hateful, and my friends didn't think of it as hateful. But then, the more you collide with life and people very much unlike yourself, the more you could either take the stance, well, I'm right, you have nothing to teach me. But I wanted to know God. I wanted to learn more about God, and that meant knowing everything that He created. So that meant confronting gay people as they are and listening to them carefully. And the things they were saying, and not just them, my Muslim friends, my Hindu friends, the things they would talk to me about didn't mesh well with my evangelical views. So I got to a point where, like, well, either they're all wrong and I'm right, but I know I'm not that smart. Like, I knew that about me. So I'm like, well, this is really screwed up, because what's going on here? So maybe my idea of God is wrong, because after all I know about God is what I get from this Bible, and I'm interpreting it, and other people are interpreting it for me. So I went to Regent College to study it, and the more I studied the Word, the more I realized there were a lot of questions that people are still struggling with. So why am I so arrogant in my belief of what is right and what is wrong? So that was the first step, really, in taking a long-held belief of mine that the Bible is right, and that my version of God was right. And that was the first step in whittling away at my intellectual ego and my just ego in general.
Now, you're fortunately, most listeners already know this, that I am also in the northwest corner of the U.S. Obviously, Paul's in the southwest corner of Canada, but we're relatively close, about 3 hours apart. So, Paul, a lot of folks may not understand the context of this next question, so I'll try to frame it. This part of the northwest part of America is very progressive, much like Vancouver, Canada, is a very progressive culture, and it's a very cosmopolitan culture. It's a very, you might not think it. Most Americans who haven't ever been there might not think it, but it's a very cosmopolitan city, especially for what we think of as Canadian cities. So, Paul, do you feel that the environment also played into that, or were there other factors in that? And I asked that because I was listening to you talk, and having lived in a number of places around the world, I could see where that could happen for you, but I also could see where you, the very same person, could be located in the middle of the Deep South and never have made that next step towards being empathetic. So what kind of role did environment play? What did you clutch onto in your environment to kind of help reinforce this evolution that you journeyed through, that opened your mind and your heart to actually start thinking on a deeper level?
Well, that's a really good question, because it was like it worked two ways, for and against, because if you talk to if you talk to a lot of evangelical Christians, they will have this siege mentality that we are being besieged, that our faith is constantly being besieged by popular culture. And so all I had to do in Vancouver was step out the door and I would see this whole mix of pagans around me. So it made me think, oh my God, I need to cling to my word even more. So it actually strengthened my resolve to stick it with prayer and my version of God.
Okay.
But luckily, it worked for me in the sense that, it worked for my growth and my evolution in that if I had questions, I could just talk to people because these are the people I was trying to evangelize, the pagans.
Right.
So it's I had more of an opportunity. If I was in the deep south, I imagine there'd be a lot of people like me. There'd be no chance to evangelize. Who are you going to evangelize when everyone believes the same thing?
Right. Right.
So it became a thing where I retreated into my faith, but at the same time, because I was trying to carry out my faith and Jesus' mission to spread the word, I was confronted by a whole mix of people at the same time. And it's very strange. If I always wonder about people of strong faith who carry out missions and confront people of different faiths, and I don't know how your own faith isn't challenged, right? Because I remember an early instance. I made a Muslim friend, and the way he talked about growing up in his temple and the people he grew up with and going to camps and just had this vague sense of who God was, but it's more about the friendships.
Mm-hmm.
I was like, man, that's exactly like my experience.
Right.
So if I grew up in a Muslim household, I'd be Muslim right now. Like that's a fact, and I couldn't get away from that. So whenever I see people of deep faith confront that and yet not get challenged, I do get a bit judgmental. I'm like, I do tend to think you are not allowing yourself to think any deeper about this. Like this is arrogance getting in your way.
That's interesting that you just said that. So, and I know you're a good sport, so let me run with that question. Now, this is kind of impromptu on you, but almost to try to help us understand where not only you're coming from and where you grew from, but how other people who look up to you, who admire your work and you as a creative can maybe listen to what you're saying and reflect on themselves. So using your own words, I'm not using them against you. But,
yeah.
But you said, tending to be more judgmental of those folks who can't be confronted on their faith and then start at least being a little more analytical about their faith. So you just, and correct me if I'm misrepresenting what you said, but with that in mind, what does it mean to be empathetic to you, Paul Bay, in that respect? Because I love that you said that. That's why I'm asking you this question, because to be empathetic doesn't mean to be perfect and without scars and bruises. So I'm so thrilled that you actually just shared that comment, because I think it really actually helps ground other people who are thinking about this, who are struggling with their own emotional maturity and emotional intelligence when it comes to this, with being more empathetic. And the fact that you just showed us somebody who, is really focused and aiming on empathy through their art still has, some scars that they can show off. I think that lends a lot of credibility to everything that you're going to say going forward in this interview as well.
Yeah, I think it's reflecting on, like, everyone's growing, well, hopefully growing constantly, and it's reflecting constantly back on what you just went through and putting it in context of how you're going to go forward. I have this thing where I don't really celebrate New Year's. I've had this for a long time because I always felt that your resolution should be every day. I know that sounds really, really trite to say, but I'm dead serious. If you knew me personally, all my friends know me as someone who every day is kind of hard on myself to really learn my lessons of it's not literally every day, but as much as possible. There's a couple times a week where I have a revelation like, oh, I'm an asshole. And so I need to change my life in this small area. And that's an ongoing process. But it's you know what happened after I because I have to explain this to answer your question. After I left Christianity and became an atheist, I became a hardcore Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris atheist. So I went swinging the opposite way. And I hadn't realized how hateful I became towards Christians, Muslims. I became very, very, very judgmental towards people of faith for over a decade. I was very angry at what faith had done to me. I was very angry at what faith had done to people that I loved, that I would see as, man, they would have had a really good life had they not grown up in the church and had the church not skewed their vision of what their potential could be and making them lean on God too much. Um, so I, I grew out of that only recently, maybe only 10 years ago. I grew out of that hateful, angry atheist stage. Um, so I'm looking back at two extremes of my life as a guy who thought he knew what the universe was and where it came from, to a guy who hated that guy,
Yes.
uh, to now a guy that understands both. And
Mhm.
and I'm glad that I could see both honestly and love them both. Like I do love both versions of myself. Like I wouldn't want to hang out with either of them, but I wouldn't want to drink with them. But I do love that I went through that to get to where I am. There's an episode, not to pimp up my own work, but there's an episode of The Big Loop. I think it's episode number 4 called "All God's Children," and a lot of people's reaction to that episode was, "What the fuck?" Because it's about a guy. Spoiler alert! It's about a single father. It's about a guy who grew up in faith, has a baby that's only a head, and his Christian wife leaves him because she just can't handle it anymore, and then he has to raise this baby while holding on to his faith. And that was my way of dealing with. That was my way of telling my friends of faith, because I know when I went through my atheist stage, I hurt a lot of my Christian friends
Mhm.
because I was very judgmental to their faces about, because they used to come and listen to my sermons. And then when I fell away, I know it shook a lot of their faith.
Yes.
When I started stand-up comedy, I was very atheistic and anti-Christian at one point. And I remember after that show, the booker of the theater said, "Yeah, we only had one person complain. She left crying, claimed you were a pastor." I told her she was mistaken. I'm like, no. I was a pastor. Oh my God. And so my ex-parishioner left in tears because I think she came out wanting to support Paul the Christian, now comedian.
Yeah.
And she left in tears at Paul the angry atheist, making fun of what I used to teach her.
Right.
And so that was a very painful thing. And so when I looked at my Christian friends, I'm like, and not in a condescending way, but I wish I'm at a place where if I was given a reason, I would love to have faith again. I just don't see the reason in front of me, but I would love it, and I do appreciate what faith brings to people. And so that was what that episode was about, like resolving the intellectual part, the faith part, the need for faith to get you through incredibly awful life experiences. And there's no answers in it. It's just my way of showing empathy to all the sides, from an honest point of view.
Well, and I think that's the beauty in what you do in the art. And by the way, listeners, I know some of you may be thinking, okay, that sounds too weird. I'll check out some of his stuff, but maybe not that episode. I'm telling you, Paul, that was by far my favorite episode in that entire season. Was that one? It was just obviously the hook is the malformed baby, if you will. That just got you in, but everything that comes into that story, it was an emotional story. It really was. It was great, and I think that's one of the neat things about being an empathetic creator. So let me ask you that: why is it important to be empathetic as a person? Obviously, we've covered some of that, but also when you put that pen to paper or your hands on the keyboard, why do you feel it's important to take these things, not necessarily as your end goal for whatever you write, but just approaching your work, being empathetic?
Oh, as a writer, there is no more powerful tool after words and wordcraft than empathy, because that allows you to write a whole bunch of characters. All right, it allows you access to a point. Like for example, one of the episodes, I think the greatest compliment that I've received lately is from Brigham Snow of the Bright Sessions. And I asked him, "Do you want to be in a Big Loop episode?" And he didn't know what the episode was about. And I gave him Goodbye, Mr. Adams, which is basically a 50-minute monologue. And I knew he would nail it. And that came from me accessing every story my gay friends had ever told me. Plus, when it came to the bullying, everything I had gone through because of racism, and mixing the two. And Brigham told me, and another person who had read it, they said, "Well, you would think you were a gay writer, having read this." And Brigham was able to really pour himself into it, and that was the highest compliment, that I was able to get into a skin of a character that doesn't exist, but has experiences that are common to a lot of people, experiences that are not mine,
Right.
but have been shared with me by people in that skin.
And I love that you said, in context, access to, these characters, this greater breadth of characters, instead of just writing the character that you closely identify with. If you train yourself to be empathetic, if you focus and make a concerted effort, that you can have access to, telling in part respectfully and with a lot of research these other characters. I think that's so important because as a writer myself, I cannot imagine a world where I only tell straight white dude stories.
Yeah, it's I could tell when I write, and I'm not going to name anything, but I could tell when I read a piece of fiction, and for example, if it's a white writer writing a brown character, I could tell when they haven't done the work of empathy on themselves, of listening to people of color in their writing, and I could tell when they've nailed it, because you could hear it in the voice, you could hear it in the experience. It's just incredible when you hear. There's nothing more transportive than not knowing what the writer looks like in real life,
right?
And just reading the words, and then you see their picture, and you're like, "Wow, that person got from there to there." That is some incredible work that person has done. But at the same time, there's things that I can't. But doing that, if you know it's a work of empathy, if you know it's a work of empathy, and empathy is a tool, then as a writer, then you really have to know your limits, right? Like I would never write. Because I tried to recently, and I realized I can't do it. I would never write a transgendered character just because I haven't had access to those stories on a very intimate level,
mm-hmm.
Right? Because I have close gay friends who've told me everything, but I haven't had enough close transgendered friends who've told me everything, right? I would be copying things that I've read from other people of other people's experiences, right? It's too removed. And so it's not a work of empathy, it's a work of mimicry.
I think that's very important to know those limitations. Do you feel that that the actual act of creation through your stories, that you also refine your empathy?
Dude, that's a good question. I never thought of that. I know my views do change sometimes in the act of writing. But I don't know if it changes in the act of writing fiction. Because in the act of writing fiction, there's just too much control. For me, anyways. In the act of, like, for example, just essay writing or just journal writing, that's when I learn. Because they just come flowing out of me, and I'm like, oh, I didn't know I thought this way. But when it comes down to writing, I've already sort of done the work on myself. In the act of shaping the characters, I've already sort of like imagined somebody. So it doesn't work for me anyways that way. Okay. in fiction writing.
I want to take a second out of this episode to ask you if you knew that today was the day that you could pick up Chasing the Demon. That's right, regardless of when you actually listen to this episode, my new thriller book is out on Amazon. It's called Chasing the Demon. It's an adaptation of the first season of Subject Found podcast. Join Jared Strong as he pursues a childhood demon across the Pacific Northwest, a failing marriage, a group of people who don't want him to be doing the work he's doing, and a creature that doesn't want to be found. With a new beginning, a new end, and a whole bunch of new story elements in the middle, this is a new story of Jared Strong. Head over to Amazon today, pick up your copy of Chasing the Demon. And while you're at it, for less than $1, you can also pick up my new short horror story called The Plant. If you can multitask, you can keep listening to this wonderful episode with Paul Bay while going over to Amazon and ordering those two stories. But I'll give you a chance to finish this great conversation, but you gotta promise me to go do it afterward. All right, let's get back to the conversation. For somebody who's listening to this and maybe they just haven't had the experiences, maybe they haven't been open to it, maybe they're in an environment that's a monolith. Everybody looks the same, thinks the same, etc. and they don't necessarily, they're listening to you right now and they're interested, but they don't necessarily think of themselves as an empathetic person. Can they be an empathetic writer if they are starting at that point?
I don't know if I would believe anyone that says they're a writer, like who's not empathetic. Um, I, I'm just like, for example, I got this book in front of me. So that's why I mentioned it. But Cormac McCarthy is one of my favorite authors, and he's known to be an intensely private person. And you would never, like, I've seen a few of his interviews. He doesn't give a lot of access to himself. He doesn't particularly strike me on the surface as an empathetic person, but I imagine that he has to be. When you read his books, when you read The Road, the tenderness between him and his son. Although again, that might be just narcissism because he has a son, and he did say he wrote it about himself, and everyone else in the story is sort of evil. Yeah, I don't know. I don't know. Maybe I picked a bad example, but I read Cormac McCarthy, and I just have to believe he's empathetic to a point. Like, he just seems to write, well, at least the main characters really well, and brings me into that. Or that might be just incredible wordcraft and skill, prose writing, that he can manipulate the situation like that. That's another good question. I haven't given it much thought. I find myself the older I get, I have a lot of I don't know. I got to think about that.
Well, and that's not necessarily a bad thing, though.
Yeah. I guess that's a part of empathy too, like growing less certain. Like I grow less certain of things, and more open to things. I used to tell my friends, I'm like, because a lot of us, especially, I don't want to say especially Koreans, but a lot of immigrant families, just in survival mode. They come from a different country, and a lot of us grew up with hard fathers. And I would hear my guy friends complain, yeah, dude, I'm like this because my father was like this. And I'd always tell them, well, imagine his father, what he was like, and what your father had to, the evolution from his father to your father. He did a pretty good job considering where he came from. And whenever I mention that, it always sort of opens up their eyes. They're like, oh yeah, because then they do notice that even their own fathers over the decades have softened, have not been such hard asses. Something happens over time where you're like, yeah, I don't know anymore. Every belief I ever held has been contradicted in major ways through life experiences. And it's those people who don't recognize that grow up to be assholes or stay, the old assholes that you see out in the streets.
Oh yeah. No, it's it's that tale of you leave the hometown and then you return 10 years later and you see. You don't think you've changed much, then you see all your friends who never left the town and how they're exactly the same they were a decade ago. And as you open yourself to experiences, and that's the key though, right? You've got to open yourself. And you even said that with your example that he's empathetic to a point, and I almost feel like that's true for all of us, right? It's just a spectrum. We're all there is no capstone, there is no endpoint to the spectrum. We all just move along it, hopefully in the right direction, not necessarily. And I guess some people say stay stagnant too.
You know what I use as a this is going to sound really silly, but you know what I've been using as a measure, a joking measure, but I'm sort of serious about it with my friends. The more you understand Bruce Springsteen, the more empathy you have, because when I was in even up to my 20s, I did not get Bruce Springsteen, even though I had so much exposure to him. I remember when we were 18 years old in a frat house in Montreal, my buddy Terry Nogler, who was a hockey player, grew up in a small town, and he was a huge Bruce Springsteen fan. And he kept trying to get me into Bruce Springsteen, tried to get me to his concert. And I'm looking at Terry with his mullet, with his sleeveless t-shirts, and I'm like, and I'm with my Depeche Mode, the Cult, U2. And I'm like, no, dude, no, that's old guy music. That's not for me. Come listen to the cool music. But he wouldn't do it. And the older I get, I always think about Noggs and how, because he was one of the nicest guys in the frat. Like, he always got other people, right? Like, he looked like a jock, but whenever someone was going through something, he would crack open a beer and sit and talk with them. Mm-hmm. So I thought that was it. But now I understand he was a very empathetic person. And I think because of that, he was able to access, even at that young age, he was so precocious. He was able to access the feelings through Bruce Springsteen's stories. And only now in my 40s do I start to get Bruce Springsteen. And I'm hearing that from a lot of my friends. They're like, holy crap, now that I have kids and all my dreams have been siphoned away, I get Bruce Springsteen.
Oh, man.
I did mean it as a joke, but I'm sort of serious about it.
Oh man.
But there's things to account for taste. So
Yeah,
you might
true.
not just like you might not like saxophone solos in this day and age. So that's okay too.
But and it's to not have that. I think that's an important aspect of this, is to not have that concrete perspective on so many things, and be willing to be malleable, which is, it kind of goes against the grain in a lot of conventional thought that as folks age, they get stuck in their ways and they don't want to change. So it's interesting that this seems to be a theme with you, that, as you've matured, you've actually become more malleable and open to things. So I'm interested in any tips that you might have for folks, practical, applicable things that they can employ, that they can actually behaviorally, that they can do in their day or in an interaction with a friend or a stranger. But is there something that you deliberately do for yourself to make sure that you remain with that focus on empathy and trying to understand others' plights and trying to see it from their perspective?
I remember, so I was a high school teacher for 12 years. And the best advice anyone ever gave me was one of my professors before I got into teaching full time, who told me the best teachers are the best learners. And that always stuck with me.
Mm-hmm.
And so when I went into teaching, I thought, well, I'm a funny guy. I'm a very charismatic storyteller. Every time I've told stories since I was a kid, groups of people would hang on every word. So I knew I had that gift. So I'm going to wow these kids, take control of the classroom, make them learn my lessons, and entertain them while I'm doing it. And that's how it started. But then you hit a wall where kids stop being impressed. Like they're like no longer impressed by your stories. They're no longer impressed by your jokes. They need authenticity. And to get to that point, I had to it's really hard because you're a teacher and you want to hold on to power because that's control that's classroom management. Like you have to keep everyone controlled or else everyone goes crazy and won't listen to your lessons. But there's a line where you can walk where you retain classroom management control and become vulnerable to a point where you listen to them and you allow yourself to feel for these kids. And teaching at a East End high school, there are kids from all walks of life and all these different experiences. And I remember one time, because when I was I divorced when I was 27, when I just started teaching, and I was so angry because I was an angry atheist now. I was angry at religion, and I was angry at myself for having been sucked into religion. I was angry at my ex-wife, and I'm like, what am I going to get? What if there's a God? What am I supposed to learn from this fucking divorce? That's what I was thinking.
Mm-hmm.
And then years later, I remember this kid, just, how at the last bell, people sort of hang around after class at the end of the day because they have nowhere to go. Like I learned that after a while. I'm like, oh, these kids hang around not because they're lazy. It's because they don't want to go home. They don't have any friends to hang out with. And so I remember the one kid, I sat with him. I'm like, okay. And we started talking and I found out, oh, his parents are divorcing. I'm like, okay. So I talked to his parents. I'm like, hey, this is really affecting your kid. Are you guys fighting in front of him? And they told me everything was going on. And then when he hung around again after school, I made a choice. I'm like, screw it. I'm just going to tell him. So I just told him, and as the first kid I told, I was married once too. And his eyes just opened wide. Like he didn't believe his idol teacher, Mr. Bay, had ever failed at life, right?
Yeah.
Because that's a life failure to a lot of people. And so, and I told him, we divorced. And I'll be honest, if I had a kid like you, we might have stayed married longer, but we still would have divorced. The only reason, I'm sure your parents love you, but the only reason they're staying together a little bit longer is because they love you so much. That's how much I love you. So it's not your fault. And that really made an effect on him. And I realized, holy shit, I used that awful example from my life experience that I thought had zero value. And I used it now to help somebody else.
Mm-hmm.
And I realized then empathy is a very powerful thing. And not only helping others, but shaping myself. Like I found myself becoming a better person because of my kids around me.
Right.
And I think when I left teaching, it just sort of carried on. Like don't walk into a classroom or any situation thinking you know it. Like just open yourself up, listen, watch very carefully, look for signs, and I'm going to learn something here.
Right.
And that became a life lesson for me.
And and it goes back to that old adage, right? That you should be listening twice as much as you should be speaking, kind of thing. Exposing yourself to someone in a different situation than you, it's going to cause a lot of, well, I shouldn't say it's going to, that's very concrete, but it can cause a lot of consternation. It challenges a lot of assumptions that people have, and that stuff is scary. But again, that's part of the growth of a person and that emotional intelligence. It gives you a better grounding, a better understanding. And like through your example there, you were able to enrich the life of somebody. And the neat thing is you don't know how long that paid off for, right? That kid could have gone on to great things now, and he's paying that forward to 5 other people, right? And it's just, that's one of the beauties of, taking that time and being empathetic and reaching out to other people, because more likely than not, if you make a positive difference in somebody's life, they're going to go pay it forward to another person or another 10 people.
And I want to talk about the empathy thing, because I think this is the one thing that's kind of one of the most important things that's sort of absent in a lot of people's lives.
No, I absolutely agree with you. I think that, again, that's why I was so excited to have this conversation with you, especially knowing the fiction that you put out there in the world and the fiction that I put out there in the world. It's one of the things that really bothers me. I ask my family, I drive empathetically, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
I'm one of those people who will bitch about the people who hang out in the left-hand lane. And it won't be a speeding thing. It'll be a thing of, if you're, blocking up lanes of traffic because you're just doing the speed limit in the left-hand lane and you're not passing anybody, you don't know if that car behind you is a person who's trying to rush to the hospital to say goodbye to their dying mother.
Yeah.
That literally, that's how I see the world through empathy, trying to understand the plight of other people and be considerate of them. It drives my family crazy. Trust me.
Oh, dude, I'm still not. I'm still not there. Like people, my friends know. Like all the person I've changed into when I'm in the car, I haven't changed. I'm still that asshole in the car. Like it all comes out right there. It's all been just sublimated. To be honest, I haven't changed at all. It just sublimated till I drive.
That's awesome. So let's talk about I got a couple more. I want to get into some other fun stuff to do with you as a guest that I do with all guests, but I do have a craft question. I know this on this show, I try to stay away from craft and we just weave it into the conversation, but this one I'm very interested in your thoughts on. When it comes to I don't want to frame you or stovepipe you as a horror writer, because you're not just a horror writer. So just darker story elements that you create in your story, do you feel that serves, fosters, facilitates the empathetic angle that you try to approach with? Or is this something that any author out there, romance, sci-fi, steampunk, anybody could actually weave into their stories if they were so interested?
Just talking personally, I think the horror elements in my stories, the ones where I use horror elements, that's not so much empathy. That's just sort of like a psychological, cathartic release.
Okay.
It's just let's talk about this thing that is at the back of our minds that scare the shit out of us, and I will put words to it, and we'll have fun while doing it. It's more like it's that old impulse of gathering around a fire and taking turns trying to freak each other out, and it becomes a communal thing, and it's a way of connecting, because I love it when I put it out there and people respond on Twitter. Oh my God, this is scary. That it's just fun. It's a communal fun thing to do. So I don't think I exercise empathy in the horror part.
I found for me that when I write things other than horror, there's still elements of it in there, but I maybe it's just because I focus more on that. I'm more sensitive to it in my horror. Because that's what I try to do with my characters, is really layer the story in a way where I want you to be, where I want to angle empathy and topics where sometimes people don't feel safe to approach. So I was curious about you as well, if you did that or not. So listeners, at this point of an episode, if this is your first episode of Horrible Writing that you've listened to, you won't know this. I'm about to ask Paul for a horrible writing example from his own life that he has to share. Now, you might be wondering, why would I ask a guest to share a horrible writing experience? Well, here's the thing. Paul's going to share his horrible writing experience with us. And I don't know what it's going to be. You won't know until he shares it. But what I feel is when we take writers and authors and folks who have already shared with the world, put out there into the world, their creations, we put them on a pedestal. And sometimes we think, man, they've just had the road laid out for them. It's been, just one favor after another, or life just breaks for them, or whatever it may be. And oftentimes when guests share their horrible writing experience, we'll see that that is not indeed the case. So let's see what we can learn from Paul this time around. Paul, what is your horrible writing experience?
Okay. This one's very painful to talk about.
Okay.
And it's embarrassing, and it's going to make people think poorly of me. But I don't care, because I'm not that person. I'm still that person, but I've learned. So this was a long time ago, and I've since talked to this woman, and she's forgiven me. But a long time ago, I dated this girl. I won't say her name, but things were going okay, and we're on our third date or something. And then she said, "I got to tell you something." And this was just when the internet just started up, so I didn't really have search techniques or anywhere to go except the library, but I was too lazy to go to the library. She said, "I got to warn you of something." I'm like, "Okay, what is it?" She goes, "I'm bipolar." And I said, "What is that?" Because I'd never heard of it before. And she sort of explained it like, well, I can be moody at times. I'm like, "Oh, okay. Well, that's fine. I can be moody too." She goes, No. This is it's a medical thing." And then she showed me her medicine. She brought it out of her pocket. And I'm like, "Oh, what is that?" She goes, I take it. This is what I take." I'm like, "Oh, okay." But she was such a lovely person that I couldn't imagine what a mood swing looked like. And so things were going great. And then she said, "Let's go out tomorrow." I'm like, "Okay." And I met her at the spot, and she didn't show up. And I tried to call her, no answers. And she sort of ghosted me for like 4 days. And I was like, "Well, what the hell went on?" And my brain had not processed what bipolarism is.
Mm-hmm.
So I wrote this long letter saying, "Hey, you know what? I don't think this is going to work out, because I need someone who's going to be there for me. I know it's early, but I really didn't appreciate the way you just sort of dropped out, and sort of the term ghosting hadn't been around. But I said, you just ignored me, sort of played me along. They sort of ignored me. Like, I'm glad we didn't proceed any further with this. You made me feel embarrassed." And I said all these things, and it was a well-written letter. And then she finally called me and said, "Let's go out." And I'm thinking, I don't want to go out. And I'm like, "But can we meet?" And we met. We had a quick coffee. I'm like, "Listen, yeah, I don't think this is going to work anymore. But here, can you read this letter? I'm going to take off."
Oh, no.
And then she read the letter. Years later, I learned what bipolarism is.
Mm-hmm.
And I felt so ashamed. Like, because I didn't say anything bad in the letter, but it was more like, "Hey, 1 minute you're here, next minute you're not." Like, that's such a stupid thing to write in the context of what the situation was. And luckily, one day I'm at a cafe and I hear, "Paul?" And it was her. And we sat down, had a coffee. She laughed her ass off about it because she'd forgotten the letter. And I explained to her, just like I explained to you, what I'd done in the letter. She goes, "Oh my God, I think you're right. I think I remember you saying," me going back and forth, and me going, "What are you talking about? I told you I was bipolar." And so it was luckily I had a happy ending, but man, was I an idiot, using my words to sort of contextualize something for someone else who had already given me the context.
Right.
Right? Like, what was I, like, it was a whole page of nothing, basically.
But that ties in nicely with what we've talked about here. And it does. It shows, your evolution as a person. Who knows? The stories that you have blessed us with in the past couple of years might not be what they are had you not had experiences like that. And obviously, had you not been able to pull back and go, "Oh, wait a second, Paul, you're an idiot," and grow from that. I do truly feel that when we have those opportunities to grow and we take them, that it does enrich what we go forward and create, because we've got that experience to lean off of. And, I'm glad that it ended well too, that she was actually, very kind and forgiving.
Yeah, well, that was just lucky to be at the same place at the same time. Where also this would be like, it'd be one of those things in my life where I'd be like cringing every time I thought about it at night. Those thoughts you have, like, "Oh my God, I can't believe I did that years ago."
Oh yeah,
to that person, right? So luckily we ran into each other again.
Well, maybe it was
and she had the grace to forgive me.
Maybe it was divine fate, Paul.
Oh, maybe. Oh, time to believe.
Okay, so hey, we have had a wonderful conversation, and I feel, my personal mission set. This show has always been about listeners. Those of you who have been around from the beginning know this: empowerment through candor. That we lift each other up, that we support each other as a community. Because I know in my own head, I'm my own worst enemy. I'm almost done with Chasing the Demon, which is going to be the first novel I release, which is basically the adaptation of the first season of Subject Found into novel form. And I hit a chapter where I was just horrible to myself on Saturday afternoon of this past weekend because I hated myself, thought I was stupid. Why do I do this? And we can be our own worst enemy. And it's very important that we take time to do this for each other. And Paul has given us so many gifts today when he's talked about this. If you felt resistance at any point during this, I do encourage you to do the mirror check and do some reflection. Think about why you reacted like you did when he said something that made you react like that. There might be something there. You always can write me and let me know. And we can talk, and maybe, I can pass something along to Paul, and he can, if he's got time, maybe have a follow-up chat about it. Before we get out of here, though, I want to have a chance to talk about some of the great stuff that you've done, Paul. But again, I want you to be able to share what you want to share. So you have some great stuff out there that listeners who maybe don't even know what an audio drama is might not be aware of. Can you give us a little bit of an idea of some of the work that you've done in the past and maybe a hint about what we can expect from you in the future?
Sure. If you go on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts, you'll find look up the Black Tapes. That's something I did with a friend of mine. It's now, I think we just hit 50 million downloads.
Wow.
And it's in the vein of Serial, about a ghost hunter who doesn't believe in ghosts and the journalist searching out his mystery. And we are in the middle of we ended season 3, saying it was the series finale, but turns out there's more story to tell. So we are continuing it this year, and we are actually writing it right now. And then I have The Big Loop, which launched last Halloween. It's an anthology series. Season 2, I'm still writing it, so it's coming up in a few months. And I think it's going to be 12 episodes long, I believe, instead of 6 episodes, because I feel like it should be longer. But we'll see. If you want more, I have a Patreon, Patreon/The Big Loop, where I upload videos at least once a week talking about what I talked with Paul. Like, I open up about my life, my process, the things that got me here, things that I'm thinking about, ideas for stories. And, I talk a lot. It's supposed to be about writing, but it's a lot about failure, life redemption. So that's on my Patreon. It's a lot of videos of me walking with my dogs and talking aloud because it gets lonely. And then I have this website I don't keep up anymore. It was a book. It's called You Suck, Sir. And it's my conversations with my students. And they're mostly funny. Some of them are sort of sad, but they're just poignant little vignettes, scenes from my classroom. I've truncated it for concision reasons, but it's basically almost word for word the exchanges I've had with my students.
Oh, that is neat. That is neat. So,
that is yousucksir.com if anyone wants to look at it.
Yousucksir.com. Okay. I will. And folks, I will make sure that I put these in the show notes for us as well. So it sounds like both Big Loop and Black Tapes will make an appearance within 2018 then?
Yes.
Oh,
yeah.
Awesome. I did not know that about Black Tapes. So that's 2 almost exclusives in this episode from Mr. Paul Bay, folks. That's a double whammy for an episode of Horrible Writing. That's awesome.
Unless something else comes up in the Black Tapes again.
Right.
The way we have it right now, it should be 2018.
That is awesome.
Somebody knock on wood, because I can't do this again.
All right, Paul, where can folks find you out there on the interweb?
I'm at Mr. just Mr. Paul Bay for Twitter. Instagram, I think I'm also Mr. Paul Bay. I don't really remember. And I think that's it. The BigLoopPodcast.com and the BlackTapesPodcast.com. And that's it. And if you had any issue at all with what I said today, please feel free to tweet at me at Paul Sading. and just go at it. Just whatever words you want to use. Just just say Paul Sading you, and then just go at it.
That's a major bump set, and I'm just waiting for the spike now. Oh, man. It has been an absolute pleasure. The other Paul. I had to work that in there. That's James's fault. James from T-Public. He's done a recent interview with Paul, and then I had an interview with him this week. So he claimed I was the other Paul. I said, no, Paul Bay was the other Paul. So just to, keep things straight for you all. Paul, it was an absolute wonderful chat. I was looking forward to this for a very long time. And I'm really, really appreciative of you taking so much time out. And I feel, again, personal mission set aside, this is just a very important conversation for folks to have, but especially creatives. We've got to start thinking like this if we're not already. So thank you for your time and coming on Horrible Writing.
It was a pleasure. I was looking forward to it too. Thanks for providing this platform for me to talk about this stuff.
Oh, most definitely. This has been Horrible Writing, and hopefully after this episode, you suck less than you did at the beginning. I am Paul Sading, your host extraordinaire. You can find me over on the Twitterverse at Writing Horrible and over at paulsading.com/horrible-writing. Until next time, suck less.